into the lesson. Today is all about natural selection. That's the title of today's lesson. Today is November 12th, 2020, and it is the third day of our 8th unit. So the objective for today, biologists will be able to explain how natural selection influences the changes in species over time. And our essential question, how does natural selection influence evolution? So at this point, you should be writing down the title of the lesson as well as today's date. We do have more notes to take today than we have in the first 2 days of the unit. So I do want to make sure you all are ready to go. Thank you, Anthony. Oh. All right. So natural selection is a common topic. And the good thing about our biology class, and I was just explaining this to my honors block before you all, is that we get a brief overview of all these different types of biology. And so as you all think about continuing your education, whether it's in college or some type of internship or externship or apprenticeship, you can start to think about which of these topics of biology intrigues you most. It could be evolutionary biology, which is what we're talking about in this unit. It might be molecular biology, which is what we talked about in the first unit. It might be cellular biology, which is what we talked about in the second unit. It might be genetics. It might be biotechnology. So we get a little bit of an introduction to each of those different types of biology, and you can go on and specialize in any one of them. But in this unit, we're going to learn a lot about natural selection, and I think it's one of those topics that you all will be most interested in because you've heard about it, you've probably seen it taking place and might not have realized it, but you're just more naturally drawn to this one because you've got some prior knowledge. So I want to start off with that prior knowledge. What do you already know about natural selection? What do you guys already know? Okay, no one knows anything about natural selection?
isn't natural selection like how the evolution of stuff is and stuff?
Okay, good. So we know that evolution is related to this concept of natural selection. In fact, natural selection leads to evolution, so that's good. Anything else?
Oh, isn't it also how like animals and plants like choose? I mean, morally animals, but how they choose their food and stuff. Like,
Yes. So we do know that competition is involved, and animals having access to specific resources like food is definitely a part of natural selection. So that's good. Okay, so we don't know much about natural selection. That's okay. We're going to learn a lot about it today, at least the basics. Maybe you've heard of the survival of the fittest. That's another phrase for natural selection. And survival of the fittest is not necessarily talking about which organisms can lift the most weight, can run the fastest, can scream the loudest, can outmaneuver their prey. What we're talking about when we say fittest is the ability to reproduce. So the individuals that have the greatest access to resources are more likely to survive and pass on their traits. That's what we mean by fittest. You've got to be able to pass on your genes to your offspring. So natural selection is defined as the process in which organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. This theory was first explained by Charles Darwin, but it's now believed to be the cause of evolution. So go ahead and write down the definitions as you see them on this slide. Okay. So this theory of evolution, which of course arose out of this theory of natural selection, really came out of Charles Darwin's travels to the Galapagos Island. The Galapagos Islands are off the coast of Ecuador, but they're pretty far away from the mainland. And so what Charles Darwin observed is that there were many bird species that existed on the Galapagos Islands that simply could not have flown from Ecuador to the Galapagos Islands. They were too small. Their wings were too short. Their wingspan was not long enough. So it's just simply impossible that they could have flown all the way from Ecuador across a vast ocean to the Galapagos Islands. So what he began to realize was that there must have been a time when the islands were much closer to Ecuador, or there was some type of land bridge that would have led to the Galapagos Islands. And perhaps there was only one original species of bird that made it all the way to the Galapagos Islands. And from that species of bird, the process of natural selection created all these different types of birds. We're going to talk about why that happens and how that happens. But these Galapagos Islands are really the foundation of these theories of natural selection and evolution. Let's watch a quick video.
The ancestors of these iguanas almost certainly lived in the jungles of Central America. There, still today, you can see iguanas in the trees overhanging the rivers, nibbling leaves, or on rafts of reeds. Just occasionally, are swept out to sea, and the vast majority, of course, die there. But just a few, a long time ago, were fortunate enough to be swept by favorable currents out to the ocean and pitched up here. In their ancestral rainforest habitat, iguanas are vegetarians. Here, they browse on juicy leaves. But the iguanas that first appeared in the Galapagos could find no such things. So these iguanas, to survive, had to eat the only kind of leaf that was available. Seaweed. And to get the best of that, they had to do something even more radical. They had to swim. They even learned to dive. They acquired the ability to hold their breath for up to an hour, so that they could swim down to a depth of 20 meters. Their claws strengthened, so they could cling to the rocks on the seabed. And under the water, they found an endless supply of seaweed, which grew in abundance in the nutrient-rich currents that flow around the islands. But that was not all. Their snouts became flatter to help them graze. And their teeth became sharper to grip the slippery seaweed.
Okay. One more.
This living laboratory of evolution helped to inspire Charles Darwin and continues to offer a unique opportunity to explore a pristine, natural ecosystem. The Galapagos Islands are located 620 miles, or 1,000 kilometers, from the South American mainland, but a world apart from anywhere else on Earth. The archipelago and its surrounding waters, located where 3 ocean currents converge, are famed for the unique animal species found nowhere else on Earth, including marine iguanas, giant tortoises, flightless cormorants, and a diverse variety of finches. The islands have two airports, Isla Baltra and Isla San Cristobal, which are serviced by regular flights from mainland cities Quito and Guayaquil. As water temperatures change and seasons shift, different types of wildlife become more or less plentiful, so it's worth keeping a must-see species list in mind when planning your itinerary.
All right, so the Galapagos Islands provide a really important case study, not only of natural selection, but just of biological diversity in general. We see a lot of different life forms coexisting in a very small plot of land, relatively small plot of land. And so it's cool to see how the food chain develops. It's cool to see how different species can live near one another and benefit from one another. And all of that is present on the Galapagos Islands. But as it relates to natural selection, we want to know what causes this process to take place. You all have already written down the definition of natural selection, but we want to know what actually causes natural selection to take place. If we think about any ecosystem, we have to acknowledge that within that ecosystem is a limited supply of resources. So even though species have the ability to reproduce exponentially, because if two individuals, two organisms have 4 children, and then each of those organisms also has 4 children, then the population explodes in size exponentially. That in theory can happen, but the reason it does not is because there's a limited supply of resources. And when we say resources, what are we talking about? Any idea of what we mean when we say that there's a limited supply of resources? What is meant by that language? Any ideas as to what we mean when we say limited amount of resources? What resources are we talking about? Okay, land is a big one. Thank you, Nick. So we might be talking about space. There just might not be enough space for all of those organisms to exist. What else?
Food.
What's that, Joseph?
Food.
Food. That's a huge one. There might not be enough food to feed all of the organisms. So for some species some species are herbivores, so they feed on grass and other plants. So eventually, those grasses and other plants will be depleted. They need time to regrow. So if that runs out, then the species won't have enough to support all of its members. Some species are carnivores. They eat other animals or insects. If they deplete those resources and they eat all of those animals and insects, then the population simply won't have enough food to survive. So food is a big one. What else? Thank you for that, Nick and Joseph. What else can we think of? So food is a good example of a biotic resource. But what about abiotic resources? Things that are not living. Nick already said land, but can we think of anything else that's not living that still has an impact on the size of a population?
Water.
Water. Yeah, there might not be enough water available for every member of the population to drink. Some of that water might be seawater, so you can't drink it because it's salty. Some of that water might be polluted, so you can't drink it because it's unhealthy. So, water is a huge abiotic factor that has an impact on the size of the population. We could also think about soil. So, some plants can only grow in certain soil types. If the soil ends up getting polluted or it becomes too salty or too acidic, then it's not going to support that plant species. We could also think about the availability of mates. If there simply aren't enough males in the population, then not every female is going to be able to have offspring. It's not going to be able to reproduce. So when there's a limited supply of resources in the ecosystem, there's going to be competition for those resources. Individuals are going to have to compete over land and water and specific soil and food and mates. Some individuals, because there's genetic variation within a population, some individuals are going to have advantages. And that's just natural. Within a given species or within a given population, of course, every member is a little bit different. Every individual is a little bit different. You've got some individuals that are taller than others. You've got some individuals that can swim better than others. You've got some individuals that can think faster than others. These are natural variations that exist within the population because of genetics, because of mutations. But these differences give certain individuals an advantage. So the individuals that end up with that advantage, they end up having favorable adaptations. They tend to survive and they can reproduce more. And so that means that they pass on those favorable genes to their children. And so now their children have the favorable trait as well. So when we think about natural selection, we have to associate survival with reproduction. That's why the phrase survival of the fittest is so important. Survival ultimately equals reproduction. And reproduction, of course, means passing your genes on to your offspring. And when that happens, you start to see more and more individuals within that population having those same genes. Those same genes are going to accumulate within the population over time. And this is what we define as evolution. Evolution is the accumulation of favored genes leading to slow changes in the population over time. Evolution is the accumulation of favored genes leading to a slow change in the population over time. Okay. So hopefully that was ample time to write down what you're seeing on the slide. Again, we should be writing down the highlighted phrases and sentences. So there are four components of natural selection. These four things lead to natural selection: genetic variation, inheritance, competition, and reproduction. So we really just talked about a few, but genetic variation, like I said, is always going to be present within a population because no two individuals within that population are going to be exactly alike. You're going to have some individuals who have certain traits and others who have different traits. And there's going to be a huge spectrum of those traits. So it leads to all these differences within the population. If we look in this image here, this says a lot about what natural selection is. We've got these birds, and they have a diet that prefers these green beetles. And we can see that to start off, there are quite a few of these green beetles.
Mr. Rowe, what is that animal right there? Is that an antelope?
Sure. Your guess is as good as mine. So we can see that these green beetles start off as the predominant, the majority within this beetle population. There are only 3 orange beetles and looks like maybe even about 20 green, maybe not that many, but 15 green beetles. But the birds prefer the green beetles, so they're going to start eating all of the green beetles. So eventually, there will only be orange beetles left. And those orange beetles, for whatever reason, the birds don't like them. So those orange beetles will survive and they will reproduce. We have to think of survival as equaling reproduction. They will survive, so they're much more likely to reproduce. When these orange beetles reproduce, as we just learned in our last unit about genetics, they are much more likely to have offspring that are also orange. And so you'll get to the point where the population is not so heavily skewed green, but then it'll be maybe 50-50. You've got about the same amount of orange beetles as you do green beetles. And then it'll start to shift even more, and you'll end up with even more orange beetles in relation to green beetles. And maybe even eventually the green beetles will all be eaten. All right, so that genetic variation that's always there, is always a part of the population, is at the very foundation of natural selection. And then inheritance, as you inherit your parents' DNA or your parents' genes. Competition, as individuals within a population have to compete with one another for resources. And then reproduction, as the individuals who are able to survive are able to reproduce and have offspring of their own. So what environmental factor causes changes in a bird species' beak shape? What environmental factor?
Weather.
Okay, weather is maybe one idea. Yeah, weather certainly can have an impact. What else are we thinking about? And I love that you mentioned weather too, Joseph. That was one of the abiotic factors that we didn't talk about, but that's an important one. Yes, thank you, Nick. The diet is really the driving force here. The food that the birds want to eat. So these different beak shapes came out, they arose out of a diet. Instead of one population of birds having to compete for only one type of food, let's say that they are all competing for a specific type of insect that lives in the bark of trees. Eventually, there's just not going to be enough food to go around. But instead of them all competing for that exact same type of insect, well, then maybe another type of beak allows another bird to start eating insects from the inside of flowers. And then another type of beak comes about that allows another type of bird to suck the nectar out of flowers, suck the nectar out of flowers, and they can survive on that. And then another type of beak develops so that another type of bird can eat the berries and the fruits from flowers. And then another type of beak develops so that another type of bird can eat the nuts that are inside of those fruits. All right, so these different beak shapes ultimately are because the birds want to have access to different types of food. And it's not, I say want to, but I shouldn't use that language. It's not a conscious decision. It's not like they just woke up one day and they're like, I want to eat that. Let me change my beak shape. This came about because of genetic variation. And it also came about because of natural selection. All right. So let's do a practice problem. The question asks, or it says, most individuals of a certain species of bird have medium length tails, but tail length ranges within the species from very short to very long. So that sentence is telling us we've got genetic variation. It's already there. Even though most of them have medium length tails, there are some that have longer and some that have shorter. That's genetic variation. If a new predator arrived that preferred to prey on birds with medium length tails, which graph describes the most likely result? So now we've got a new predator coming into this ecosystem, and the predator is going to start eating the birds with the medium length tails. That's its preference. Medium length tails. What's going to happen to that bird population? Which of these graphs depicts what happens to that bird population? We've got on the x-axis tail length. So our shorter tails are down here closer to the y-axis, and our longer tails are down here further away from the y-axis. The number of birds, or the size of the birds, or the number of the birds, is increasing on the y-axis. So the higher up on the y-axis we are, the more birds there are. The lower down we are, the fewer birds there are. So which of these graphs is going to depict which happens to the bird populations over time?
D.
What was that, Joseph?
D. I'm thinking A or D.
A or
D.
B? Okay, so let's talk about those two options.
A or D.
Or D, okay. Let's talk about those two options. So in D, what Joseph is saying in D is that the birds with the short length tail are going to decrease in size. There won't be many birds with short length tails. The birds with the medium length tails are going to, are going to have quite a few. Population is going to be high. And the birds with long tails are going to be just like the birds with the short tails. There won't be many of them. So we see this curve, this bell curve. Now, graph A depicts something quite different. Graph A depicts birds with short tails as being high in number, and birds with long tails as also being high in number. But the birds with the medium tails are shorter in number. So these graphs are basically opposites of each other. But we have to keep in mind that the question tells us that the predator is preferring to prey on birds with the medium length tails. So it's going to eat these birds right here. If these medium length tail birds get eaten, then of course their population size is going to drop. It's not going to go up. And what's going to happen is that the birds with the short tails and the birds with the long tails are going to start to take over the population. They're going to start to reproduce more. They pass on their genes. And so more and more of the population has either really long tails or really short tails. Eventually, maybe these become two different species of birds. Who knows? But A would be your answer here. Now, when we think about natural selection, one of the best case studies from history is the study of peppered moths. And this study takes place in the context of the Industrial Revolution. So before I start talking about it, I want to know, what do you all already know about the Industrial Revolution? What do you already know about the Industrial Revolution?
It was hard for people to get jobs.
Okay, so yeah, there were definitely new industries that came out of it, and so a lot more jobs became available. What else? Yes.
Mr. Rudd, wasn't the industrial movement started with like cars and stuff, like
Yeah,
building?
so good. And I see Jessica also said development in the 18th century and urban industries. Good. So in some of the largest cities in the Western world, London, New York, Boston, um, Paris, we start to see industries arise that lead to technological advancements like cars. But because of this, like Nick just said, we see environmental changes as well. And it's really the Industrial Revolution and all of the advances that come out of it that have really led to global warming over the last century and a half or so. And we can see some of this taking place in the UK, where there was a large population of peppered moths. Before the Industrial Revolution, those peppered moths looked like this. They were largely white. They had some black spots, but we can see that they blended in pretty well into the bark of trees, which was also pretty white. After the Industrial Revolution, as the bark of the trees grew darker, the population of moths also became increasingly dark as well. So as you all said, the Industrial Revolution took place beginning in the end of the 19th century, the 1800s, as massive amounts of pollutants were released. We're burning all these non-renewable resources like coal and natural gas, and this releases high levels of soot, pollutants, carbon dioxide, smoke into the environment, and it covers the surrounding landscape in this chalky black material. So if you look at pictures back then, obviously they were in black and white, but you can even see it on some of the laborers. You can see it on their skin that they're like, it looks like they're covered in dirt, but it's not dirt, it's soot. And so the trees that were once lighter in color became progressively darker. So we can see here, this tree is almost black at this point, and the white moth sticks out very, very easily. You can just obviously see this white moth. That white moth was what the moth population looked like before the Industrial Revolution. Afterwards, maybe you didn't even see this one because it's blending in so well, but afterwards, this is what the moth population looked like. It was much darker on average. Now, again, there was genetic variation before the Industrial Revolution. There were some darker moths before the Industrial Revolution took place. There were still lighter moths after the Industrial Revolution took place. But we're seeing a shift that dictates that before the Industrial Revolution, most of the moths would have been lighter in color. And afterwards, most of the moths would have been darker in color. And that's the process of natural selection. So the moths camouflage themselves with the trees in order to hide from their predators. So just think, before the Industrial Revolution, most of the trees were lighter in color. So the white moths were able to hide very well from their predators. The darker you were, the easier it was for your predator to see you, and the more likely it was that you'd be eaten. So before the Industrial Revolution, you see light moths as the predominant color. As the Industrial Revolution goes on, we see this thing called industrial melanism taking place. The trees and the surrounding environment is getting darker and darker and darker. So it actually benefits a moth to have a darker color. And now the lighter colored moths are at a disadvantage because their predators can see them much more easily. So over time, the population becomes much darker. We're almost done, almost done. You don't need to write down these yellow sentences at the bottom of the page. You just need to write down the definitions of these examples. So the first example is coevolution. Coevolution is joint evolution of two or more species. And this is commonly seen in symbiotic or predator-prey relationships. A symbiotic relationship is one that ultimately benefits both species. So if we look at that example in the bottom left, the bee and the flower evolve together so that the bee can fit its mouth into the center of the flower. The bee benefits because it gets the nectar from the flower. The flower benefits because the bee ends up covered in the flower's pollen, and as it flies around, it starts to pollinate other flowers. So that would be a mutually beneficial symbiotic evolution. But a predator-prey relationship would be like the one in the middle. Monarch butterflies mimic poisonous butterflies. So they look just like them. They start to develop wing patterns that look just like a poisonous butterfly, even though they themselves are not poisonous. They just want the birds to think that they are. The birds, on the other hand, also evolve. They become better at detecting which insects are actually poisonous and which ones are not, which ones are actually edible. And then we've got a clownfish, which provides nutrients to the sea anemone, and the sea anemone provides shelter and protection to the clownfish. There's your Finding Nemo, and Finding Nemo lives inside of an anemone. Nemo, not Finding Nemo. Okay. Speciation is another example of evolution, and this is when a new and distinct species is formed. Often speciation is created by some type of environmental barrier. It might be the case that an earthquake has torn apart the land, or a new river has resulted from flooding. And so one population ends up getting split apart. Over time, those two populations that were once a part of the same population might develop into their own species. And this is what we call speciation. So go ahead and finish writing down those definitions. We can see in the image in the bottom left that the snail populations are getting split up by some fissure, some crack in the ground, and eventually they become different species. Okay. And one of the most famous causes of speciation, one of the most famous causes of geographic isolation is Pangea. So maybe you've heard of Pangea before, but Pangea is theorized to have been the supercontinent that existed many millions, even billions of years ago. So at one point, all of the 7 continents they existed together as one. So North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and Antarctica all were geographically next to each other. Over time, because of the movement of tectonic plates just under the Earth's surface, the continents were separated. However, organisms that once lived maybe just right on the western coast of Africa could have just walked across into South America. They didn't have to cross any water to do that. Or if they did have to cross water, it was shallow and it was not, it didn't span much land. Therefore, you see species that exist in Africa and maybe in other places around the world that there's just no explanation for how they could have gotten across that vast amount of space. You see elephants in Asia, but you also see them in Africa. You see crocodiles in Australia and also in Africa and also in North America. So the theory is that the animals themselves didn't move, but the continents did. Okay. All right, so we've got 14 minutes left. I think you all should have ample time to complete the Kahoot, the natural selection and adaptation Kahoot. The link is already in Canvas. It's one of your U8D3 assignments. The natural selection gizmo is going to take more time. You might need to make that a weekend assignment. But the instructions are all there. The instructions to do it are all there. Let me pull it up so I can explain it to you all just to be sure. We've used gizmos before, but it has been a minute. So if you need me to find your login information, please let me know.
Wait, Mr. Rudd,
Yes.
do you have
Right.
that? Do you have that first quarter thing like every other teacher? Is that what that modules is?
Yeah, there is going to be. I'm going to put it up by tomorrow.
Okay.
Good question. Thank you for reminding me of that. But you all should be able to see my Canvas screen now. So you see that there is an assignment called the natural selection gizmo. I've got all of the directions there. So you should literally be able to walk from one step to the next in order to access and submit this assignment. You're first going to need to go to this link, the Explore Learning Gizmos website, log in. Some of you never even made an account the first time we did Gizmos. So you will need to do that. And the class code is there. This is not our class code. This is my honors class, but your class code is also on Canvas. Those of you who do already have your account should just log in. If you've forgotten your login information, I can find that for you. Then you will go to our class and you'll scroll down. You won't have to scroll, but it's at the bottom of the list of gizmos. It's just the natural selection gizmo. You'll click on the launch gizmo button. You'll do the student exploration sheet. I've also put the link for that worksheet right here, so you can also access the worksheet right here. As usual, you need to make a copy, change the name of the document to include your name, and then save the document to your biology Google folder. It's going to walk you through exactly how to use the gizmo, and you'll answer the questions as you go. Then you'll take the assessment and you'll submit your worksheet, and that'll be it. So this is a longer assignment. It's worth more points. I'm open to potentially making it formal, but I need to see you all actually attempting to do it. What you don't realize is that if I make an assignment formal, but you don't do it, then it hurts you a lot more than if it's informal. So it doesn't matter just that I make something formal. What really matters is that it gets done. All right, so as always, you have until the end of our unit, which is next Wednesday, November 18th, to do all of the assignments. You have 6 days. As long as you get them done before 11 or by 11:59 p.m. on November 18th, I will not consider it late. Okay, so I would go ahead and start with the Kahoot. Let me send the link to the Kahoot to the chat right now. You all can do that on your own time, but you might as well go ahead and start now. It's just 20 questions. It shouldn't take much time at all. And you also have until 11 p.m. on November 18th to do that one as well. So I'll be here on mute if you have any questions. We have 11 minutes, but I think you should definitely be able to get started on one of those two things, one of those two assignments. Okay, folks, it is 1:20, so you are now good to go. We have 10 minutes before fourth block. Please do let me know if you need anything between now and tomorrow. We do have the assignments starting to pile up, so make sure that you are staying on top of them. If there's anything I can do to assist, please do not hesitate to ask. I look forward to talking to you all again tomorrow.
Mr. Rudd,
Yes,
we still got that meeting, right? 3:30.
yes.
Okay. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
Class ended.